This is a panel that's near and dear to my heart. I'm not going to introduce myself, except to say that I have worn two hats in my professional career. One as a development specialist, focusing on rule of law and human rights, and the other as a historian. And I will reflect on both of those. We'll get to the historian bit later when I wrap up our proceedings today. But it is my pleasure to sit on this panel wearing my development hat because, in fact, this panel is the panel that's designed to talk, okay, we've spent a day and a bit now assessing the challenges, identifying the problems, looking at the issues, and now we have to ask ourselves, what do we do about it? And this panel is eminently qualified to address the question of what do we do about it. It's my pleasure to introduce you to four experts in the field of rule of law in Iraq and Afghanistan. They developed their expertise in different ways and through different capacities, and I think that will make this panel incredibly rich for our discussions. They're seated very strategically. To my right is Brigadier General Tom Ayres, who joins us from active duty. He has served in Iraq and Afghanistan. He is with the U.S. Army JAG Corps. He's Director of Military Law and Operations there, and he has spent a lot of time over the last sort of 6, 7, 8 years thinking about rule of law as part of the military's mission in Iraq and Afghanistan. To his right is retired General Chuck Tucker, who is now at the DePaul Institute for Human Rights and Legal Institutions. And he also similarly spent many years active duty, starting in Bosnia, working on rule of law issues. He now is in the Legal Academy at DePaul, doing fantastic project work in Iraq and Afghanistan that he's going to discuss with us today. And so you can see the kind of evolution from military into civilian institutions here. Next to General Tucker is Professor Erik Jensen, who joins us from Stanford Law School. And I have to say, with Professor Erik Jensen and Professor Clark Lombardi, who is to his right, we have captured the West Coast mafia on rule of law projects in Afghanistan and Iraq. I was very envious when I got to Penn Law and started looking into these issues that Stanford Law School and University of Washington Law School, where these two gentlemen are based, have been some of the most active institutions focused on rule of law reform and have really kind of been at the leading edge. So we look to Professor Jensen and Professor Lombardi, both of whom are prominent academics and experts in their fields, but also doing excellent development work to talk to us about what their organizations are doing and what they are seeing that is working, not working, and where things might go. With that, I will turn it over to General Ayres, and I look forward to a great discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you very much. It's my great pleasure to be here. The last time, though, I was in this room, it was a library. There was a lot more sleeping going on in this room than there is now, which is a testament to the previous panels. I think there have been great discussions, and it's really an honor for me to be here to try to continue that discussion. It's also a great honor for me to be here in the city of Philadelphia again, a place I called home for a while. And I'm reminded as I was running around the city of Philadelphia that this is a city that was intimately involved in the revolution, intimately involved in the birth of a democracy and a country that now espouses the rule of law, but in conflict. And we're talking about two places where there is differing levels of ongoing conflict. And when I look down at my own uniform, the Judge Advocate General Corps insignia, it has the one number on it, 1775, because that's when it was instituted, begun by George Washington. And we say it set the conditions for a disciplined military force that abided by the rule of law, And then, of course, the Army, the Continental Army, set the conditions for the Republic overall. And so you have that dynamic that happens many times, and as we hope, again, with Iraq and Afghanistan, that all the conflict there now will abate, and that you'd have two countries that would be on a secure path in the future. And so what I thought I'd talk about, though, is as we think about the coming decade in Iraq and Afghanistan, what is the role of the military? I would try to give you my idea of that. What is the role of the military with respect to our participation in rule of law activities? And I guess my bottom line message to you is it's actually pretty limited. We are myopically focused on security, as you can well imagine, and we are not well positioned to do much about the big issues, many of which we've talked about here today in the military. We're not well positioned to deal with corruption. We're not well positioned to deal with the kind of constitutional debates that we've had here today. And we do leave that to the civilian agencies and to the academics and others, the NGOs who are involved at that very senior level to deal with countrywide issues. But we are focused on security, as I said. And so as we're involved in Iraq or Afghanistan, a commander will have a given piece of ground. Typically, we have a brigade combat team, 3,000 or 4,000 soldiers, and that brigade combat team will have two attorneys. One is a major, he's responsible for giving advice to that commander on all his responsibilities with respect to all six of what we call our core legal disciplines, so administrative law, labor law, environmental law, claims, if claims are filed against us, international operational law responsibilities with respect to Geneva and Hague Conventions and things like that, command discipline, and then there is a captain there as well who is the prosecutor. And so you have these two attorneys. But when a commander has a piece of ground and he's responsible for maintaining security, he hears rule of law and he thinks about the judicial system. He says, rule of law, lawyers, and he turns to the two lawyers and says, you guys go fix that. Okay, you jags, you got to go do that. And in many ways, that's been to our detriment over the last 8 years with respect to our six core legal disciplines, our investigations, and maybe even some of the command discipline, because we've been focused not only on the things that we've always been trained to do, but we've had to focus upon this rule of law mission, and we're not well suited to do that. So we're trying to respond to that. We're looking at pulling more reserve attorneys forward when we have a commander who is given a piece of ground. But we're also obviously always interested in partnerships and with other organizations. And you also have obviously heard that we in the military, Secretary Gates and Secretary Clinton have both agreed that you need more civilian agencies, you need more presence from Department of State, Department of Justice, and other agencies in these conflicts because we don't want, as we establish rule of law and security in Iraq and Afghanistan, you don't want it to be militarized. You want to pull the military back at some point. Now, the other thing is these commanders, as they have responsibility to establish stability and security in a given area, we realized pretty quickly as the insurgency got completely out of control in Iraq that you can't establish security until you have, one, the opportunity for jobs, you have economic redevelopment, and you have a legitimate government that people will buy into. And then I think it becomes clearly obvious that you have a chicken and egg situation. How do you establish security until you have these other things? How do you have these other things, economic development and jobs, until you have security? You have to do them simultaneously. And so it was later on in the insurgency that really we saw the development of provincial reconstruction teams. You've heard that term before, I think, today already, PRTs. And so those PRTs who were, in many respects, they're supposed to cover the full realm of activities that a government should develop, healthcare, infrastructure and civil engineering, waste pickup, all those types of things, and also governance and rule of law. Those PRT teams, though, in Iraq, they're very bare bones. And what we found in Iraq was those PRT teams, they could do a lot to assist, but you have many of them that are there on 6-month rotations, and they would have different interests. And so many times in rule of law, for instance, you might have somebody who comes in to a PRT team as a rule of law expert, very interested in governance, and that's great. Or the next one might come in and very interested in commercial law, which you need, or very interested in women's rights law, again, what you need. All very good things, but to the commander who's responsible for that piece of ground, he's not as interested in any of those laudable goals as much as he's interested in security. And by security, what he means is let's get functioning courts. If we pick somebody up for a crime, or we pick somebody up for a terrorist activity, we need to be able to put that person in jail. And so a quick example from my first time in Iraq, we had somebody that we were able to arrest who was going out and he was cutting down the transmission lines, the big towers, and then stealing the copper and the titanium from those transmission lines to sell those. And that, at the time, our authority to detain people under U.S. authorities to detain people was for terrorist type activities, not for activities that were against the state of Iraq. Obviously, though, if the state of Iraq didn't have electricity, it's not good for that whole chicken and egg discussion I just talked about. So you want to be able to not have this guy running around the streets and going down, cutting down more of these very expensive electrical transmission towers. So we bring that kind of person to the Iraqi judicial courthouse in downtown Ramadi, and the judges are hesitant. And I would agree with what was said earlier today. I would go to that Iraqi courthouse at least once a week and sometimes 2 to 3 times a week. And you would see many sections of the courthouse running very well. You see commercial law being transacted. You see family law transacted, and a long history of doing that. And you had a judiciary that was not tainted in many ways by Saddam, because most of Saddam's convictions and the things he was doing with special courts. He was not doing with the courts that were throughout the land and with the judges that were throughout the land. And so there was a good judiciary there in Iraq. But as we tried to push on this case in particular, for instance, you would hear, well, I'm not really sure about the evidence. And then if you would, gather lots of evidence, and then you'd start to hear, well, I'm not really, I'll be able to do that case, but I'm really not so secure here. And in fact, their lives were at risk. And in fact, what we found out was that many of the judges with criminal cases, the only case that they would really work on and look towards convictions toward were those where there was really an outcast in society, a true criminal, no one who was connected to a family or a tribe or a clan that was connected to some other family, tribe, or clan. And it's really because if they were connected to family, tribe, or clan, then the judge, their protection was not guaranteed. And in fact, it's not just that the judge, as I think the ambassador said last night, it's not just the judge himself. Sometimes we have very brave judges, Iraqi judges, but their families were at risk as well. So a family member would be killed, sons, daughters killed, spouses killed. So how do you ask somebody to make that kind of sacrifice, to sacrifice their own families? I think many of us are willing to sacrifice our own lives, but not willing to sacrifice our families. So, so it's a very hard thing. And so we try to get the security needs met, but then as soon as you started to meet some of the security needs, it would go back to the evidence problems. And so, there was always, it seemed, an excuse early on in Iraq, and the criminal justice system really was not working. And I think because of that, primarily, again, the U.S. forces were detaining quite a few personnel, and we had our own detention system, and we had the authority to do that under the UN Security Council's resolution. And so I just kind of want to wrap up the picture in Iraq and how we got out of that situation, and then draw some quick analogies to Afghanistan. So in Iraq, when we decided upon a counterinsurgency strategy, as I said last night, we ended up having a total of 20 brigade combat teams. So 20 of these commanders out with 3,000, 5,000 troops, with their legal teams interacting with courthouses. We also had 25,000 detainees. And with those 25,000 detainees, we had varying amounts of evidence, but we decided we needed to send quite a few attorneys over to Iraq, and there was what was called a law and order task force. There was also Task Force 134, who were all looking at all these different case files and trying to develop the cases to give them to Iraqi judges so the Iraqis could detain them or convict them under their authority as we thought about transitioning out and putting the Iraqis back in the lead. And so one of the principal things that the Law and Order Task Force did was they were working with what's called the Central Criminal Court of Iraq. And the Central Criminal Court of Iraq was the key court that was being used for the American detainees. Now, in fairness, the Central Criminal Court of Iraq actually acquitted quite a few people that the Americans wanted convicted and thought we had the evidence to convict. They were actually very fair and equitable. But I think what we learned was no matter how fair and equitable they were and how much they listened to process, they were definitely seen as the American court. That was the perception by the Iraqi people. And it turned out that what we expected, that Central Criminal Court of Iraq to lay groundwork for and serve an example for courts in the provinces, turned out it wasn't a good example at all. But what it did was it helped us understand, as our attorneys were working with Iraqi investigative judges and with the Iraqi system, we started to understand what the system was. And so we were able to give that, give kind of that knowledge out to the judge advocates who are working out in the provinces. And so as we look towards the cessation of the UN Security Council resolution, where we no longer had the authority to detain on ourselves, and we had to have anyone that we were going to detain was going to have to be at the request of the government of Iraq, but also under Iraqi law. So we would have to have a detention order to go out and do operations and snatch a bad guy off the battlefield. We would have to have an arrest warrant. We had to learn pretty quickly how to do that, and we had some experience through the Central Criminal Court of Iraq. And so as that UN Security Council resolution expired, we had some of that knowledge, and we actually started to see that the transition to the Iraqis in the lead was much more seamless than we feared. And in fact, from my own personal opinion, I think we did not realize how vested in the future of Iraq, or maybe it was, again, our arrogance, and as we talked last night, the American cultural-centric view of things. We didn't realize how vested in the future of Iraq many of these Iraqis were. We questioned that. We feared that maybe they weren't so vested in the future of Iraq. And in fact, when we were able to when we let go and put them in the lead, we found out they were very vested in the future of Iraq. And the people who were a threat to U.S. forces, to terrorist acts, to improvise explosive devices against U.S. forces were also seen as a threat to the Iraqi government, and they truly were. I mean, the Al-Qaeda and its affiliates were certainly as focused upon the nation government of Iraq as the U.S. forces. So I think from that, just one other point about when you're working with the military, as many of you think about working in the military, I told you that we have kind of this myopic view about security, that the commander wants to get the criminal system working, doesn't really care about those other pieces except for how it goes into economic redevelopment and can help break that chicken and egg cycle I talked about. But the other thing is, it's true, some of the criticism you heard, that we have a short-term mentality. And one example of this is, as we're working with PRTs and the Department of Justice and Department of State representatives in Baghdad, an example would be that you, at a local level, out in a provincial courthouse, a commander wants to give laptops to the judges so they can more easily do the work, so they can get on the internet, see the latest changes in laws, and would want to use some of the funds that they might have available to do that, to give those judges, to make them try cases more quickly. But then the people in Baghdad might say, well, no, that needs to come from the ministry. We need to strengthen the ministry ties to the provinces. We need to strengthen those links, and that's the way that the system works. But of course, then a commander will start to get frustrated, because sometimes to have things go through Baghdad down to the province will take months, if not years. And you've lost all these opportunities. You have soldiers out on point, putting their lives at risk for months, when certain people are, you could have cases lost and terrorists released back onto the streets. So there's that inherent tension, I think, between the long-term view, which there's valid reasons for the long-term view, and a short-term view. Okay, well, quickly then on Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, what we see now is, for years, we had, at most 2 to 3 brigade combat teams. We did not have a counterinsurgency strategy. We were not out amongst the population except in the eastern province. And so with the change in strategy that was advocated by the military and then accepted by the president, we saw 2 different increases of troops. American troops, a decision for 20,000 new troops by President Obama, and then another decision for 30,000 new troops by President Obama, and then a tripling of forces by the NATO members to try to implement a counterinsurgency strategy where you'd have forces throughout the country, and then you have commanders doing the same kind of thing. And so you've got your desire to interact with the local judges, but at the same time, what we found is, again, we have detainees in Afghanistan that we house. We've decided to surge attorneys to Afghanistan to work on those case files, to start to move those detainees and those cases into the Afghan system. I hope and I think we've learned the lesson from the Central Criminal Court of Iraq, and so that'll impact how those cases are dealt with. The other thing is, in Iraq, that we learned, it wasn't until we really partnered with the armed forces early, but until we partnered with the Iraqi police, that we were able to understand the problems that they were having with detention facilities, the problems they were having with gathering evidence and forensic evidence. And so when we had American units partner with these units, there was a level of sharing information that was done, and we could start to teach them. And I don't want to, well, we started to try to relate to them that, when you come upon an IED, for instance, take pictures, gather evidence, gather statements from lots of people, get gunpowder residue, get forensics from the bombs, and then let's teach Afghan police now all the techniques that they can go into court and present that evidence. So we're not relying upon kind of whether or not somebody is reliable in the town who might have an axe to grind against one of his neighbors. So those are also some of the things we're working on in Afghanistan, and I've well gone over my time. I wish I could talk more, but I look forward to your questions.
Thank you.
Well, welcome from Chicago, home of the world champion Chicago Blackhawks. Any Canadians out there? It's good to be with you, thanks. Always starts by alienating your audience. So I had this brief. My brilliant associate, Philly native, Julia Doherty, had a PowerPoint brief, and I was about ready to give it. And we may put this up on our website, but I've decided not to show it, primarily so I could react to a few things that have been said today. If you want the shorthand of my original brief, I suppose you could call it, I've looked at life at both sides now. Or if you prefer something like, I once was lost, but now I'm found. I used to be in the military, now I run an NGO, and so, boy, here we go. So I've decided I make 3 points, and I'll entitle I got my title. My title is Exit Strategies, IQCs, and Life. Or if you like, a subtitle, since I don't quote Elizabethan poets and playwrights, Send lawyers, guns, and money. Dad, get me out of this. Warren Zevon. Look, I think that what I'm an expert on is me. So let me just talk about me for a second. If you go back, I was active duty. We won the Cold War, right? 1990. And you think about 1990, we had been engaged in this effort for 45 plus years. And I remember, I was teaching at the Air Force Academy, and I remember a State Department person, I won't mention from which section, came in and briefed us and was talking about, the fact the wall has come down and this is a new age, but where do we go from here? And I asked, I said, well, what's the strategy? And they said, well, we don't know. And I said, what do you mean you don't know? This has been our policy for 40 plus years, that the wall will come down and we're going to move forward, and you don't know? And he said, well, we never thought it would happen. Now, I make this point about that. We've had some lectures today about Japan and Germany. I would say that the first thing about that is, we didn't have an exit strategy. In other words, we had a long-term engagement strategy with Japan and Germany. For all the technical things we did about who were they, what were they diverse, were they not diverse, we didn't say to them, I'm leaving tomorrow, and then you're going to be on your own. Clearly I'm not that smart, but I can say I've got a little experience. What I have experience in is raising kids. I've raised 3 boys. The youngest one's 20. I never once said to them, I'm not sure if I love you. But, when you get to be 18, buddy, you're on your own, because I got an exit strategy. And the more you act up, the more money I'll pour into you, but then you're gone. You're it. So we blow into these places. The Warren Zevon send lawyers, guns, and money. You got a little backwards. So first we send in the guns, right? And so if you go back to my view, we had a long strategy, which was a long-term engagement strategy with places like Germany and Japan, 45 plus years, and that worked for us. We were there. We said, we're there for you, buddy. We got your back. We're going to be with you for the long haul. The wall goes down. Now, right around that time, I used to give speeches, and I say, America goes to war about every 10 years. Let's embrace the horror. We go to war every 10 years. Then I lowered it, and I said, it's about every 5 years. Then I came back and said, it's about every 2.5, 3 years. And yet, every time I go to the State Department or the Defense Department, I continually am shown or told, well, this is new for us. It's ad hoc. We're going to come up with something. And I would just say, going back to me, I won the Cold War, did my 10 years of active duty, went into the reserves. My wife said, hey, I thought we were going to get out. You told me you're going to spend 3 or 4 years in the military and get out, and now it's 10. We go into the reserves. Now it's going to be 1 weekend a month, 2 weeks in the summer. I'm going to go to something called summer camp. It sounded fun, And so, that was it. And then all of a sudden, we're into 1993, 94, 95. My last active duty piece was what we called the first Gulf War. Of course, there had been the Iran-Iraq War and others. So 91, we're drawing down. We really don't have a strategy for how we're going to engage in Eastern Europe and elsewhere, but we go to war in Iraq. What did I say? 2001. I'm looking at a history between 1990 and 2001, and you look at that, and we got the Balkans right in the middle of that. In 1995, we go into Bosnia, and as I'm flying over Chicago today, from Chicago to Ohio, and on to Pennsylvania, I looked down and I saw Ohio, and I happened to see Dayton, and it's instructive to note that, the Dayton Accords were signed 15 years ago in November the 25th. They were initialed of 1995. And so here's my point. We're 15 years out. You want to know where we're going in Afghanistan? Why don't you ask where we started with the Cold War, how we changed in Bosnia. How's it going in Bosnia? How's that working out for us? What about Kosovo? How's that working out for us? How did the first Gulf War go for us? How did that work out? How did Central Asia work out? How did Iraq work out? And by the way, we all know we're done, right? Except, I just got a briefing not long ago. I mean, we're fully engaged in Mexico. Forget other Gulf states. We're engaged in a counterterrorism type strategy, counterinsurgency strategy in Mexico, and who's largely funding that? Well, the money's coming. Among other things that we're going to do in Mexico is move them from a civil law legal system to a common law system. but we put no money towards this. And so who's funding this? Well, U.S. Northern Command. So we're sending JAGs down ad hoc into Mexico to begin training Mexican, judges. Where's it going? Where are we going? Well, let's look at where we were. We have not done this well. And in each of the cases that I cite, we have had a short-term exit strategy. We said, we don't know if we love you really. We're out of here. If you want to know where I think Afghanistan is going, listen to the president. He says we're going to be out in numbers in a year and a half, militarily. I take him at his word. We're going to be in an American election cycle. We're going to come home. So whatever we're doing, the generals or whomever, what we're doing, we better do it in the next year and a half because the situation is going to change. The situation has changed this year in Iraq. We're down to 50,000 troops. The president says we're going to have them out next year. So we've had the guns in there. Then we sent the lawyers in, the JAGs. Now, I was a JAG. I did what JAGs do. We're primarily, among other things, we all think that we're Clarence Darrow, right? So you go in there and you focus on security. You focus on the police. You focus on the courts. You focus on, corrections. And it's all about security. It's all about us. When we're talking about the Central Criminal Court of Iraq, what we were essentially saying was we're going to pour millions of dollars into training in a court that was not indigenous to Iraq. We're going to train it so that they can try insurgents or terrorists who were trying to kill primarily us, as well as some Iraqis. But they were killing us, and we did it. It was all about us. And then we're going to leave. What did our military do in Iraq? Well, it set up a system that may or may not have legs. But we started because we were saying, we want to get out of there. Get me out of this. On Afghanistan, we're building up a service that, is going to have 500,000 people in the security sector, and they're going to pay for this how? We're going to spend the next year and a half, stepping up in the surge, throwing some people in jail, running some kind of a court system, then we're going to go home, and then what? So on the history piece, on the exit strategy, I would just say that I think we need to start thinking with Iraq and elsewhere about long-term engagement strategies, not short-term exit strategies. I'm not suggesting we keep tons of troops in these places. What I am suggesting is we don't have a plan for how we're going to engage in an adult relationship with other countries over the long haul. And until we do that, it's a wasted effort. It's like saying to your 18-year-old, I'm out of here when you're 18. On the issue of IQCs. What's strangely missing, I think, in this conversation was the fact that many people have been talking in that passive tense, second-person voice. We should do that, or they should do this, or it should be done. Well, as the general just said, the military, our military, has been doing a lot of this work in the field. But they're going home. They want to go home. They have an exit strategy. But we, to the extent that we have any kind of an engagement strategy, we outsource it, right? How many here know what an IQC is? Right, a couple of you. Let's go back to this. This within the last 2 months, it's an indefinite quantity contract. If you worked for Halliburton, if you worked for Checky, if you worked for L3, CPI, Civilian Police International, you sure as heck know what it is, because you're bidding on multi-million-dollar contracts to go off and do the training work overseas. What's strangely missing from this conversation was we've had all these constitutionalists in, and we've had diplomats in, and we've had professors in, but nobody who's actually, other than the general and his few people, and he told you his limitations, the people who are actually going to implement the rule of law. The ones we're paying to go over there. Now, we just put out a contract on Kosovo, $24 million plus. There was a $45 million, give or take, IQC, indefinite quantity contract, that was let recently on Iraq. We're told that there's a $150 million IQC for Afghanistan, and then there is a $500 million IQC in the offing, $500 million for the rest of the world. And none of the professors here are going to get it. The military, not going to get it. Now, our institute partakes in some of that. And since I've been given the 2-minute warning, this goes down to, my third point, life. And again, let me just say, this is my part of the speech where I do talk about now I'm found. Or perhaps what I would say is, to quote another great poet, John Lennon, life is what happens when you're busy making other plans. Look, life goes on in Afghanistan and it goes on in Iraq. People get married. People want to get divorced. They want to set up businesses. They want to dissolve businesses. They want to go to school. They want to get a job. Are they concerned about security? Sure. They're worried because their wife, their daughter, their mother is having to walk 10 kilometers in 120-degree heat to get water because there's corruption. That's a security issue. Before I even get to the Taliban in Afghanistan or the Suns, whoever you want to pick out in Iraq, I've got to deal about the basics. How do you stay alive at a Maslow's hierarchy of it? And the thing is, our military is not doing that. And L3, Jackie, I don't pick on them particularly. They're going to do what they were sent in to do. They contract for a goal. When the money runs out, they're going to go out. Who's going to engage in these long-term, day-to-day things that really affect people? And I'll end on this. I'm at a law school. Now, I know that it's pretty intriguing for many of you to sit here and think, boy, I wish I could be a constitutional scholar and maybe one day be Jefferson and go out and write somebody else's constitution. Some of you have illusions of I saw a judgment at Nuremberg and I want to go out and do war crimes work. That'd be cool, wouldn't it be? We can blow in someplace and do some, throw some bad guys in jail. I would say to the rest of you, come on out. If you really want to do something about this, if you want to engage in a long-term strategy, a long-term engagement strategy, then come on out and do what we do. Don't cede the field to the private contractors only. Form groups within schools like University of Pennsylvania. Do what we do. We go out, we do the contracting, we get out in the field, we get our hands dirty, we're training judges, yes, but we're there for the long haul. We're training universities, we're universal. We're already entering into joint degree programs. I'm ready to start sending US students to northern Iraq within the next year or two. That would be a goal. We're already bringing their students here. We're doing joint exchanges, running joint conferences, joint degree programs. We're already engaged. We're sending students to work with the Iraqi government. All over. I've got 30 MOUs with universities throughout Iraq. You can play in this. You can be at the Lewis Carroll thing of cabbages and kings. I heard a lot of stuff here today about kings. I'm here to talk about cabbages. How do you get food on the table? How do you set up a government? How do you set up a local system? How do you set up education and training programs that work for a university? How do you get sustainability? How do you deal with women's organizations where we're doing real work on honor killings, real work on gay, young men who are being thrown into jail because somebody finds out they're gay. That's something we can do something about while everybody else is arguing about the Constitution. Businesses, connections, getting out there in the field, doing the training. This is what you can do. Join us. Come on out. The water's great.
So I've got to be as entertaining. I want to thank the University of Pennsylvania Law School, the Constitution Center, ACE Group for funding this event, and particular thanks to Amy for, God knows, conceiving of this event, as well as Lauren for implementing. I want to start with an anecdote that I think tells 3,000 words. I went to Afghanistan shortly after the Taliban fell. Mucked around for a while on the ground trying to figure out what the Asia Foundation might do to strengthen the rule of law in Afghanistan. And after my time there, I met with a senior development official who I will not name, and he said, "So Erik, what's your idea on strengthening the rule of law in Afghanistan?" And I said, what I would do is, first of all, understand the very basic, obvious point that virtually everything that's been happening in Afghanistan is informal. So it's really fundamentally important to understand what informal institutions are doing and doing well, and what informal institutions may not be doing as well, and try to imagine alternative institutional arrangements. He said, that sounds pretty fancy. I said, no, it's really, really practical. Why is it practical? Public institutions are really expensive, and they are a scarce resource, and you don't want a lot of duplication in public institutions of what is carrying on informally. And this has been a fundamental problem in the state-building enterprise of imagining a glorious, full-service government when we know that that is not going to be possible in decades and decades. I said, so what's your idea? And he said, well, a group of city bankers were just through, and they said that Afghanistan needs a commercial law. And I said, this is a profoundly bad idea for a couple of reasons. One is, if everything goes right in Afghanistan during the next 10 years, it may need some attributes of a commercial law. That's not what Afghanistan needs now. Look around you, the Taliban just fell. And secondly, in my opinion, it's doing harm. And why is it doing harm? Afghans know how many needs they have. And when you are fiddling around, passing a commercial law that couldn't be further from the realities of the vast majority of Afghans on the ground, it builds a wall of cynicism. Now, my advice was not taken, which isn't the first time. What are some of the lessons of that story? One is, and this has been a curse of the development industry, particularly law and development, for years and years, and that is that it's been anti-empirical. And it's a real problem. You can't just assert doctrinally what you would like life to be and normatively speculate. It really helps to actually know what's going on the ground. Second, and this feeds very much into what Chuck just said, it suggests an incentive to tick a box. There are major contractors out there who simply have to tick boxes of micro indicators of success. We can have and hold a commercial law, and that's very helpful. Oh, by the way, the response I got from this senior development official was, of course it makes sense to write a commercial law. We can have a commercial law drafted before the Afghans have their pencils sharpened. Now, so that's the box ticking. It really helps. A third lesson is, and we've heard about it in previous presentations, taking into account informal institutions. I've been utterly pained by how long it has taken the infrastructure, development infrastructure in Afghanistan to realize how important it is to gather data on informal institutions. And a final point here that relates to some of the students here as well as many generations of law and development, and that is, it's a field where you can't just get off a plane and do it. And many people think you can, but you actually need to know a lot about the failures of the past and the successes of the past to do it well. I want to touch on 4 things in the remaining time that I have. One is, I, like Chuck, am one of the world's foremost experts on me. I'm going to talk about me for a moment. Second, I want to revisit the formalism and informalism discussion that we had this morning. Third, I want to ask and answer the question, do we have a grand theory of development? And fourth, getting right down to the grassroots, what can you all do, especially the students here, to sort of join in and do useful work. So in the 1990s, for 6 years, from 93 to 99, I was the Asia Foundation's representative in Pakistan and its nominal representative to Afghanistan as well. During that time, the Asia Foundation and Aga Khan Foundation oversaw the only economic development assistance link between Pakistan and the US. What was the total of that link? $10 million. I also oversaw the Afghanistan program, which at the time had a reserve of $35,000. And I tried to figure out what to do with $35,000 in Afghanistan. And the Asia Foundation actually funded the BBC's program New Home, New Life, talking about basic problems of health and sanitation and other things. And the BBC at the time was the big mullah, as it were. Everyone was listening to the BBC. The bottom line of this talk about me is that disengagement isn't the answer, but how we engage and how we intervene. There's a broad canvas of questions and critical thinking that needs to be engaged in. So on this point of realism and formalism, Jacques Delisle isn't here right now, but he wrote actually in the introduction to an article that he wrote some years ago, Lex Americana, hysterical anecdote about a commercial law professor who had just been to Mongolia and had drafted a commercial law for Mongolia. And after he returned to the US, his Mongolian counterpart wrote to him and said, would you please send many copies, I can't remember how many copies, of the commercial code that we just wrote. And the commercial law professor was just so honored that there was actual demand for the product that he had produced. And, but at the end of the Mongolian counterpart's note, he said, please send it copied on one side of the page. So it turns out that there wasn't demand for commercial law and copies of the commercial law in Mongolia, but Mongolia at the time was suffering a paper shortage, and his Mongolian counterpart was really interested in the blank side of the page. I was asked a number of years ago by a multilateral development bank to write an arbitration act for Pakistan, which I did, several different versions of it, in fact. And then I went around the country and tried to find out who was interested in the Arbitration Act. And I found one person, a lawyer in Karachi, who was interested in the Arbitration Act. I said, please, do you know anyone else in the country who's interested in this act? And he said, no, I think I'm the only one. I just returned from Bhutan a few days ago. Bhutan has an insolvency act passed in 1999-2000. And I was having dinner with the CEO of the Bank of Bhutan, and I asked, why do you have an insolvency act? He said, I don't know. I said, it's never been used. He said, I know. He said, no, I do know why. There was a multilateral development bank interested in insolvency. I said, oh, I know the multilateral development bank. And he said, I think someone at Harvard. I said, oh, I know exactly who did it. It wrote the Insolvency Act at Harvard. The fact is there was no demand for it. There's a commercial court in Kabul. I've been asked to which actually doesn't, at least to my knowledge, doesn't have any business. To my knowledge, there have been several cases filed in this commercial court over the last few years. I've been asked to do research on what demands there are of commercial constituencies for dispute resolution. Well, please, this should have been done at the outset. This is the field of dreams approach to legal institutions, that is, build the courts and hope that people will come. And it goes back to my point of the need for empirical work, understanding demand, understanding constituencies. Third, is there a grand theory of development? No, there isn't. And that's part of our problem here. We're all sort of cogs in a wheel because there is no grand theory of development. There are three theories that my colleague at Stanford, Steve Krasner in political science, thinks might be out there. Actually, he's quite sure they're out there, and I think the categorization is helpful. One theory is modernization theory. That is, get economic growth going, educate populations, and there will be a trajectory of secularism and democracy. Now, there are many problems with the modernization theory, given our experience over these years, but that is definitely one theory out there. Another is capacity building. Eric Feldman, during lunch, mentioned the bureaucratic capacity in Japan. beyond Germany and Japan, which are often used as successful transitions, I want to talk for a moment about South Africa. I was having dinner with Justice Albie Sachs of the Constitutional Court in South Africa several years ago, and I said, why is it that South Africa's judiciary made such a successful transition from apartheid to post-apartheid? And he said, Erik, you know, during apartheid, judges said, I'm just upholding the law. They were well educated, they were well trained, and yes, they were just upholding the law. Post-apartheid, they gave the same answer. We're just upholding the law. Now, the point I want to make is that they were well-trained and well-educated, and they had the capacity to actually apply the law. So I throw out South Africa as another example of a very successful transition. Fazil yesterday, last evening, talked about the Iraq Appellate Court in 1985 standing up for itself in a decision that it had made. And when you look at Iraq and Afghanistan, by far the biggest difference between these two diverse countries is the bureaucratic capacity. The de-Baathification was patently a stupid idea. Bureaucratic capacity is so difficult to build up, and breaking it down makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. In fact, in my more cynical moments, I think that some donors focus on judicial reform because civil service reform has been such a monolithic failure across countries. It's an extremely difficult thing to do. So capacity building is another theory out there on development. It's necessary but insufficient. It needs to feed into an incentive system that works. Rational choice institutionalism is another big theory out there, and that's essentially let's make a deal. Trying to figure out how to do durable pacts that work. And the Magna Carta back in 1215, the barons press King John and they say, let's do a deal. And that works. It's a classic case of a durable pact. But trying to figure out how to do these pacts is also very important. I'm writing a piece now, is development a process or an event? And of course, in the academic world, you're always provocative, so I'm arguing that it's an event, even though there are processes involved. Finally, on the role of universities, Clark is going to talk more broadly about the role of the academy. I want to first note, because many of you who are students who are interested in law and development, please do read David Trubeck and Mark Galanter's classic article of Wisconsin Law Review, 1974, Scholars and Self-Estrangement, about the law and development movement. Mark and David have excellent analysis in that article. Unfortunately, the reason that it is the 13 most, ranks 13 in the most widely cited law review articles ever is for a conclusion where they proclaimed that the law and development movement was a failure. This is absolutely wrong historically. There were exchanges going on between Latin America and the US of legal academics. Those exchanges, if you talk to the people who were actually involved in it, were some of the most momentous experiences in their lives and changed them forever. Also, the proclamation of the failure of law and development was big news to Europeans who weren't aware. This is an American proclaimed crisis in law and development. I've thought a lot about how to engage students in law and development work. I've got 3 field-based projects in Afghanistan, Bhutan, and Timor-Leste. And in Afghanistan, we are writing and building out a legal studies curriculum at American University. We have written 4 texts in Introduction to Laws of Afghanistan, Commercial Law, Criminal Law, International Law, and we'll be going on to other subjects. These volumes draw extensively on Afghanistan law and Afghan examples and critique and think critically about the law and how it might develop. I might say that one of these high-priced private contractors that Chuck has mentioned has paid out, let's put it this way, 50 or 100 times as much to private contractors to do the work that my law students at Stanford have done, and the quality ain't nearly as good. One thing that law students have that I think is a fantastic resource is you're all taught to think critically, to write logically, and these skills may seem very basic to you, but you get out into the real world and you find out how important those skills are in any walk of life. So you really do have some value to add. I don't think it's appropriate to, for example, ask students to codify customary law. Whether that should be done in the first place is a big question, but whether it should be done by students is a very easy question to answer. So I guess I'd leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Now I'm going to turn it over to Clark. If you could just wrap everything up for the day, Clark, that would be really helpful.
I'll just wrap everything up for the day. And for the last 30 years, since we've heard that that we have to take that into account as well. I will try to wrap up fairly quickly, and it's not that hard for me to shorten my talk because a lot of the things that I wanted to say were said by previous speakers on this panel. And I think I agree with most of the things they say, and frankly, the things you've heard today are consistent, I think, with, or at least the things you've heard over the last 15 minutes to 45 minutes are consistent with what we've heard throughout the day. And I think that's actually quite useful. And for that reason alone, I think just hearing it over and over again and realizing how much agreement there is on some core points makes this a very valuable conference to have. And so I really do, again, like the other speakers, want to thank the University of Pennsylvania, the National Constitution Center, and Ayres Insurance for making it possible to do this. If I'm going to try and give a quick summary of some of the themes that are here that go on, well, I think, first of all, it's probably come out, but we should say it again, that the U.S. military has done an enormously good job at creating order, and it's done so with good faith, with the intention of creating a legal and law-abiding society. And we're very fortunate to be served by a military that sees that as something essential to do. And my admiration for the members of the U.S. military who've been working alongside rule of law practitioners is really boundless. I think they are right to want an exit strategy, and I think they deserve to have an exit strategy, and all the countries that they're in deserve to have them have an exit strategy as well. Which means that I also agree with Chuck that this means that the fact that there should be an exit strategy for military operations doesn't mean that there shouldn't be an entry strategy for everybody else. And that's, I think, essentially what this conference overall has been about. And the question is, what should an entry strategy look like? How should it be implemented? And what don't we know about what an entry strategy should look like so that we can plan one better? To me, two things came through in a number of the presentations, and I confess I already believed them, so maybe they weren't there. I was just listening, hearing what I wanted to hear from the speakers, which happens, of course, quite a bit. But there are two themes that I want to hammer at. It seems to me that most people agreed, either implicitly and sometimes said explicitly, that there are different types of rule of law, that it might be more effective to talk about rules of law rather than the rule of law. When we talk about rebuilding the rule of law, we're talking about rebuilding something that falls within a broad set of things that can be characterized as the rule of law. And it might be legitimized in Islamic terms, it might draw on different source texts, it might have different institutions, but the rule of law, the system that is going to satisfy the base criteria of rule of law may look very different in different societies. That's important. The second thing that's important to remember is that it's not for an occupying nation or for elites anointed by an occupying nation to choose which of the rules of law that fall within the set are to apply in that country. Or I shouldn't say that. Maybe it is for them to do so, but they would be well advised to take a step back and ask for broader consensus. Because one thing that I think has come through, and especially in the morning sessions, is that if the people don't like the law that's applied, they will not follow it. And it becomes ineffective. And this actually intriguingly showed up in different ways in the discussions about Iraq and the discussions about Afghanistan. because it struck me that one thing that was very interesting is Ambassador Rahim kept saying, it really bothers me that the government is taking powers that it doesn't have in the Constitution. And then in Afghanistan, we had people saying, it really bothers me that the government isn't able to exercise the powers it has been given. But ultimately, this reflects a societal consensus about what the government can or should do. When I say it's consensus, it may not be a consciously formed consensus, but it literally is a limiter on what the rule of law can be. So it's very, very important to understand descriptively what laws are in force and descriptively what laws people want to be enforced. The type of research that Andrew Garfield is doing is enormously important for understanding what's literally possible. Assuming that there are a range of rules of law that can be applied, one has to come up with a methodology and find people who are capable of helping to determine which of those rules of law correspond best to societal norms and general popular will. And that's not because normatively that's a good thing to do. This isn't an argument for democracy as a normative sense. It is a practical argument that quite simply what we're seeing is governments exercising powers that constitutions don't give them, and we're seeing governments not able to exercise powers that constitutions do give them because the society simply won't tolerate it. So this leads to a couple of programmatic points, at least to me, when I think about wrapping up things that people have said, and I confess I don't want to put words into other people's voices unless they're more authoritative than me so that I can get you to believe them, because I think they are true. The first is that it's going to be very important that the rule of law building process is a process of helping people build their own ability to build the rule of law. Now, it goes on, and it sounds terrible, but the point is really important. That when we build capacity, we're not building the capacity to apply a law that is normatively correct for a society. We're building the capacity for the society to understand from among the range of acceptable rules which one is the one they want, and then to implement it. And that is the step that, at least in my experience, I mean, I have worked now in both Iraq and Afghanistan with the EU, the US government, the US military, USAID, the State Department. There are a lot of people who are operating a lot of different programs. Many of them are incredibly admirable, some of them are less so, but whatever there are a lot of them out there. But one thing that's striking to me is that there are very few programs that are designed to build the capacity to make descriptions of the country, to describe what's going on, and then to choose what would be, and to understand what Iraqis or Afghans actually want, from among a range of, I mean, I'm not saying it's not an infinite set of things that they could do, but there is a much broader number than people realize. That is a missing step. And in our own program that we've been running for the last 6 years at the University of Washington, it's been a long process of trying to convince the State Department, and a successful one. I mean, we've had wonderful interlocutors at the State Department who have allowed us, but we've had to sell it, and we can see that they're going in good faith to sell it someplace else in the government. But the point is to tell them this: I don't want to train law professors to understand what human rights, what the proper interpretation of human rights are. We want to train law professors to read court cases, to describe what's happening, to describe what's wrong about what's happening, and to make a case, a plausible case one way or another for different understandings. We're not going to tell them what to say, but we're going to help them tell us what's happening and tell us what they think should happen. I think that's an essential first step. Experience of actually operating in a court that works, of seeing what happens, of coming back and telling us, and we ask them to describe what they saw happen in one of our courts, which is a more comfortable thing for them to do, before we start asking them to go out and ask people the questions they would really want to know about how law operates in Afghanistan, and then what one could do. And we've started sending them to tribal courts, to Native American tribal courts, on the assumption that that's actually a model that will make a lot more sense in terms of understanding informal justice systems. So our students have actually been, some of our Afghan law professors have actually been admitted as prosecutors in tribal courts in Washington State, and they go prosecute drunk driving cases, and they do mediation. And this is a very empowering thing, but it also teaches them to start looking at the range of possible options that they can apply. Now, the programmatic point that I want to follow from that, though, is that this is a very different thing than we've been asking in rule of law when all of these multi-million dollar contracts come out, and we've operated under some of them. They don't ask anyone to do this. You have to sell to you have to have a good faith person who you talk to and try and sell this to somebody at the State Department. This is actually a good idea. And they will sometimes do it. But we need to start changing, in some ways, the questions that we're asking in terms of contracting. Another thing we're going to have to do, though, is fundamentally, for that to happen, and for it to happen effectively, we're going to need to think about serious institutional change, both in the way contracts are written, about who contracts them, about the timeline that contracts are operated on, and a whole range of institutional questions that I think people have been pushing off. But they're really important, and this may be grist for a future conference, about the way that rule of law promotion projects are planned and funded at the level that they are. But it's an extremely important thing to do. Right now, we don't have the institutional capacity, either in the recipient countries, in Afghanistan or Iraq, or the institutional capacity in the US government and its contractors to actually engage in the type of legal analysis and planning that would be most effective. Among the problems, rule of law, the responsibility for the rule of law in the US government is scattered throughout multiple agencies. I've attended what are called interagency meetings in which people are coming from a number of different departments with different institutional priorities, and rightly so, which have been tasked with tiny fragments, like the blind man and the elephant. Someone's been given the trunk, someone's been given the leg, someone's been given the tail, and in some cases, no history of coordinating. And in some cases, you have institutions whose priorities are not only not overlapping, but they may be inconsistent with each other. And this is a real problem. This wasn't always the case, but the US government has dismantled its planning program, and this was mentioned by one of the previous speakers. There used to be a process by which the US government planned for it created strategic and global plans for providing either to nation build in occupied territories or to engage in systematic programs of granting aid. And all of those have been dismantled. Not only has it been dismantled at the military level, but USAID itself moved from being an institution with country specialists who worked for their whole lives, who were specialists in the subcontinent, and spent years and spoke the local language, to being a contracting agency, where the expertise that was expected at USAID was going to be someone who was essentially an auditor. And the assumption was, and it's a working hypothesis, and that's fine. One can hypothesize that the private sector could provide better expertise on a short-term basis than the US government could internally. But it actually proved just to be wrong. I'm glad they tried. I'm glad we know it's wrong, but it's time to end this process immediately, because there really does need to be, in terms of writing an efficient contract, of asking the right questions, of understanding that you have good work coming in, you need to be a country specialist. There's simply no other way around it. You simply cannot recognize when someone has told you something that is impossible, that cannot be true, because you don't know anything about the country. And that's going to be something that needs to change. We're going to need to build in the US government. I think this is part of a longer-term commitment. We're going to have to understand this is a national security interest of the United States, to not have failed states come back and reform and then become failed states again. So once we see it as a national security interest, then I think we're going to set up foreign policy think tanks the way that we have medical or physics think tanks at universities. And this is going to bring me back to my final point about institutionally. I think that it may be time to rethink how universities fit into the picture. I think the US government needs to centralize its understanding of what needs to be done, either to rebuild an occupied country, a failing state, a failed state, or simply to promote ongoing law reform. That's something that has to be done on the governmental side. It needs a partner to help it. And one thing that's also been happening around the country is the dismantling or the underfunding of area studies programs. And this is going to become a very important piece of the puzzle. I think we're going to need to understand, as we did in the Cold War, that there are defense-sensitive languages. There is defense-sensitive cultural knowledge that we are going to want to have. As just simply as a national security interest, we're going to want to have experts who are trained in this, who did 8 years of language study, field work in a country, and are available to be called on to help the government if something comes up that they are interested in and they want to help. That's something where there's going to need to be a rethink about what universities do. It's great that the Asian Law Center at the University of Washington gets these programs for 2 years. It's wonderful, and Chuck's program is truly one of the best in the country. And it's wonderful that he gets them and he does such good work. But longer term, we're going to need to train PhDs who are trained in anthropology and sociology who can help us work on these 2-year programs and can go and enter the government or, if need be, the military. So I think that there's a larger scheme, and this might involve bringing in people from schools of government or management to talk about these. But sooner or later, for this to push forward, we're going to have to do that as well. Thank you.
We're going to open the floor. I'm going to push past our 5:15 close for questions and answers. Yes, Stuart.
In the interest of full disclosure, I am one of those contractors. But, and I listened, in the interest of full disclosure, I am one of those contractor people. And I listened and agreeing with a lot of things that are said. But I also, and I know from personal experience of the firm I work with, having worked in Sudan, Bosnia, Iraq, Afghanistan, Africa, that there are a lot of problems. Short-term interventions don't always work. Our firm, and we work actively with the University of Pennsylvania. I've been an alum. I spent 10 years here. I guess I wasn't smart enough to graduate, but through various programs. We actively engage the university. The idea that it should all be university-driven as opposed to contractors, and I'm not trying to defend my bread and butter because I actually got into this on a pro bono basis, having been a lawyer who retired. It doesn't always work, and we've seen it firsthand. Some of the programs run by universities are absolutely wonderful and stellar, but sending students over, there's a real problem with some of the administration, protection, costs involved. Universities don't always act as best managers. I'm not pointing any fingers, but if you've ever attended any meetings, departmental meetings, you would see some of that. University overheads tend to be high. One of the things that contractors are now hidebound by, are some of the things coming out of Washington when you bid on a proposal. You are told what the parameters are, and we know from personal experience where we tried innovative things, and we are the firm, not to blow our own horn, but highly regarded and receive superior ratings because we try to be culturally sensitive and bring innovative procedures. When we do that in responding to RFPs, we get slammed and we don't win because they're saying, you didn't read what we said. If you had said A, B, C, D, you would have won. And sometimes that's the problem. So I think it's wonderful that with the State Department, which tend to be RFAs where you can have the latitude, it's terrific, and I think the results are much better. So I think Washington, I don't mean to talk that much, I think Washington really needs to revise some of that. Having country specialists was wonderful, but the problem with country specialists, if you look into the history of it, they tend to be in the country, comfortable in the country, and aren't always the most innovative thinkers. You've seen that with the British Empire, and certainly in the United States in the past, and I think that's one of the reasons why USAID may have gone to outside contractors. Thank you.
Let me, I hope you don't misunderstand or if I misspoke. No, I'm not suggesting that we get rid of contractors and we bring in a bunch of professors. That's not the point. I am saying that there's a role. I make 2 points primarily about contractors. Buying what the general just said. Look, the military's mission is to get out of there. There was no real reason to keep the military in Iraq or Afghanistan. There was an exit strategy for them. But the fact that we had an exit strategy as a governmental policy, that we're essentially going to disengage. And as we draw down troops, we plus up on private security contractors and we plus up on subject matter experts who are going to do sector-specific training. We're going to train judges. That's what they do. They go off and they train judges. So they set up, it tends to focus on either the exit strategy so we can go home as a military or as a transition. But once the money runs out, and this is not evil, but once the money runs out, the contractors go out. If you put a university, some universities, if you put in other civil organizations, not just universities, and you fund them to do some of that, what happens, our university's not going to go out. We've been around since 1898. We're going to be around. We're there. I've got long-term engagements. We will be there for the long haul for at least 100 years. Regardless of what the security situations are. I mean, I deal with the University of Belarus in exile. You know, we got university professors and students that are coming out of the country that we have to educate and to go back in. So I'm making a plug for the contracting rules. I mean, these things were brought up earlier. I mean, to make it easier to get civil institutions into these roles. You know, look, the RFP for Kosovo, request for proposal, all right, 20 some odd million dollars, comes out, it hits the State Department's website, you have 3 weeks to respond. 3 weeks. That's 3 weeks to come up how you're going to, what's your plan? I get a two-liner. What's your plan for what do you want to do about, you know, peace in our time? You got 3 weeks. Where's your office going to be? How many translators are you going to have? Well, look, contractors, it's not evil. They got a whole room full of specialists that they just pay to do that stuff. You know, I've got a staff. I got a very small, you know, and I've got to respond to something like that. And then when we don't get the contract and it goes out, you know, let's say recently there was a contract that came out on Afghanistan. You know, it was a no-cost, you know, it was an extension, no-bid extension. Here we got all these civil organizations ready to go into this, and a private contractor gets gets an extension without a bid. So what they're doing is essentially putting groups like ours out of business, and there's long-term implications. And so, you know, POGO, you know. Who's the enemy? He is us.
I want to agree with you and disagree with you. I want to agree and amplify on what Chuck just said. There is an irrationality in the contracting process, and those of us who've dealt with it on the inside realize how serious this is. And you are absolutely right that any questioning of a framework when you're putting forth a proposal in an RFP is unwelcomed. We're beyond critical thinking at that stage. Ours is to do and die, not to question why. And that's a serious, serious structural problem. Likewise with Chuck, there is a role for contractors without a doubt. And it depends on the type of project and what you're looking for to do. I want to disagree on the specialist issue. AID was intentionally dumbed down in the late 1980s through the 1990s. Friends of mine who spoke 7 languages, understood development extremely well, left AID. Many went to private contractors and made 3 times as much money with private contractors as they did with AID. But the local knowledge, and this is hackneyed by now, the need for local knowledge for useful, worthwhile international development assistance is absolutely essential. And multidisciplinary approaches, absolutely essential. And this is another point on the structure of the aid industry. It's very sectoral. It's all siloed. The development problems are virtually all multidisciplinary, but the development industry is set up to just respond to little bits here and little bits there without thinking. It's got the serious Frederick the Great problem. That is, one needs to understand the whole before one peers into its parts. We're peering into all sorts of parts.
Ambassador, last question.
First of all, let me, if I may, pick up on that point, because what happened in Iraq was that if you spoke Arabic and were an employee of the United States government, you were barred from coming into the country for purposes of the reconstruction that we're talking about. Arabist became a term of derision with the resultant fecund situation that we have there now. So I definitely agree with you, Erik, that there has to be a role for area experts in conjunction with people who actually know how to get things done. On your point and on Chuck's point about what he called cabbages and kings, I couldn't agree more. But what has happened in the world of state-building professionals, of which there are now cadres in various ministries around the world, at the United Nations, private organizations, universities, and everywhere else, there are boxes that they tick off, and by God, you can't have a functioning modern state that's developing democracy if you don't have a constitution. We're forced to think about the kings. First of all, the new elites want to think about it, although I think some of them would be just as happy to generate a modus vivendi. But the international community demands of us that we think about the kings, and this is not new. Iraq had to come up with a constitution in the 1920s, or else the League of Nations would not recognize its independence. Well, the same thing happened in 2003 and 2004. To get the Security Council to recognize the reassertion of sovereignty by Iraq in 2004, we had to have an interim constitution. So we're forced to think about these things. And it may be that ordinary people couldn't give a damn about what the commercial law is, or this law or that law, but I guarantee you they care about, or rather the elites care about what the Constitution says, and elites did in Iraq what elites do. When they're pissed off, pardon my language, they took to the streets. And we went into a civil war in 2006 and 2007 because the Sunni elites were dissatisfied with the Constitution. You know, I'm not sure there's much of a larger point other than I'll say what I said before. If you're going to put us through the trauma of early constitution writing, and I actually can think of absolutely no reason why we should be forced to go through that trauma, but if you are, at least give us an honest document that's going to more or less accurately reflect what's happening, because I think you do more harm to the rule of law when you don't.
Any final comments from the panel?
Well, just on that point, you know, it's not either or, right? But the thing is, I'm at a law school right here, and you're looking, I look at the cheap seats in the back, the ones who are still here after a full day. And so what do you know, when we talk about international law, what is it we project at law schools? Let's start with that. What we project is you can go off and be a war crimes prosecutor because that was really cool. You know how many students I got at international law that come and ask me, hey, how do I get a job on the, you know, on the ICC? Well, maybe, you know, if your country signed, you know, that might be a plus. But, you know, or how about that ICTY? I said, well, you know, it's ending. Oh, well, I don't want to do that. I want to go out, you know, a typical DePaul student has $150,000 plus in student loans, and when we say to them, you're going to go out and do some human rights work, you know, it just doesn't work. So what we tend to push at the university level, and this is a criticism of universities, just like contractors, we tend to push highfalutin ideas, war crimes prosecutors, human rights for, you know, but nobody wants to go in and do the tough work of the day-to-day administration of justice. I would argue that most of the students here in this room have never seen a piece of carbon paper, let alone know how it fits into the Iraqi judicial system, right? How, you know, that you're limited to how many copies you can have, how you set up judicial protection programs, how you know. So we're either going to cede that all to private contractors, or we're going to begin to develop our own capacity within the universities to send people out to do this kind of work, and then we can get a balance. Yes. Send out the people that want to deal with the kings. You know, they want to do the constitutions, and then they want to keep them in power by setting up criminal systems for them. But also send some people out that want to figure out breadbasket issues as well.
That's an inspiring note to end on. It reminds us that the end of this conference is really not an end, but a beginning for us, a time for us to think about how we can engage further. I mentioned when I started this panel that I have worn two professional hats. One is as a development professional, one is as a historian. And as a historian, I have studied how legal systems change, how political systems change. And it's a tough, there's no kind of, there isn't a lot of work that's done in the historical field along these lines. And it's tough to figure out how you ask the questions. Are you looking at legal structures, courts that are built, laws that are passed, judges that are trained, police forces that are put up, law schools that are opened? Those are the structural elements of legal reform. And you can look at those in any society in the past or in the present. Or are you asking questions about legal culture? What are attitudes towards law? And then you have to design ways as a historian of assessing how legal cultures change over time. They're not easy questions. And I can tell you that the structural ones are easier to assess than the cultural ones. And I think that today we've heard some of that at work in Iraq and Afghanistan. The other thing that I like to do as a historian is remind people that change takes time, lots and lots and lots of time. And so it is important, as much as it is gripping and relevant to think in terms of this year, next year, or last year, or the year before last, that when historians look back on this period, they will look back at it in terms of 10-year stretches, 20-year stretches, 30-year stretches, perhaps even more. So that implores us to think that we do have some time, but we do need to work day to day. It doesn't happen on its own. We need to work day to day to make change. I am going to bring this conference to a close. It has been a real pleasure. There are some incredibly important thank yous that I have to make. A lot of people have acknowledged my role in bringing this together, but in fact there are dozens of people here at Penn Law School who have traveled this road with me over the last several months. Our communication staff, our IT staff, our facility staff, students who have helped out in putting this together. Most importantly, my colleague Lauren Swift has done tremendous work in putting this conference together, and I want to take the time right now to acknowledge what she's done publicly. And finally, when you put a conference together like this one, the quality of it is only as good as the people who come and share their views and engage. And so I must thank the panelists and the audience. Thank you for making this such a fun and interesting and challenging day and a half. And as I said when I started, this is not the end, this is the beginning. So thank you.